Hi everybody, thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Nick Blumberg. Paris Schutz has the evening off. Mayor Johnson's pick for police superintendent makes his debut at a public forum.
As a Chicagoan, Chicago police officer, and a neighbor, a member of the community, I'm humbled to be chosen to be standing here talking to you right now.
CPD counterterrorism chief Larry Snelling joins a community meeting ahead of the city council considering his nomination to lead the department.
People have been denied employment, their right to bear arms, and many times their basic dignity. It's about time that we end it once and for all.
A police oversight panel votes to scrap the controversial gang database. City leaders eye a Greektown hostel as new housing for migrants. Public housing activists get their day in court as they seek to block a deal giving Chicago Housing Authority land to the Chicago Fire Soccer Club. And set your alarms bright and early. Bally's temporary Chicago casino is scheduled to open at 8 a.m. tomorrow. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Alice Yin, City Hall reporter at the Chicago Tribune, Becky Vivi, bureau chief at Chalk Beach, Chicago, our very own Heather Sharon, and from Block Club Chicago, Melody Mercado. Let's get right to it. Heather, you were covering the forum that Chief Snelling was at last night. What kind of a reception did the nominee for superintendent get?
Well, he faced mostly softball questions from members of the commission, which is to be expected because they picked him as one of 3 finalists. He faced more pointed questions from members of the public who wanted to know whether he would end the city's gunshot detection contract and whether he would be able to really restore trust between the Chicago Police Department and communities that have had very tense relations with the police stretching back decades, especially on the south and the west side. We didn't get a lot of detail or specificity about what he would do differently as Chicago's next top cop. Maybe we'll have to wait for his city council confirmation hearing for that.
Did he at least seem prepared for this, able to hold his own?
Sure. So he is somebody who the police department has relied on for much of the past decade to be an expert witness to testify in court about how police reacted to situations and whether they appropriately used force or followed department policy. So he is a very polished public speaker. He's charismatic. He's somebody who enjoys sort of the give and the take, which, will certainly serve him well in this high-profile role that everybody expects him to become confirmed to. I think the devil's really going to be in the details because he is facing massive challenges on pretty much every possible front.
It always is. Alice Yin, Chief Snelling's appearance before the City Council was postponed. Is there anything to read into there about the support that he has, or was this more of a logistical issue?
According to Chair Chris Taliaferro, he said it was more to just give the CCPSA time to fully do all the community meetings. I don't think it was required as part of how the ordinance is laid out, but he just said out of respect for community engagement that they wanted to wait until the process, that stage had completed.
And that was really the driving factor here, in this new selection process, this community engagement piece, right?
Yeah.
So, Becky, this nomination is likely the most consequential pick so far in Mayor Johnson's relatively new administration. How do you think he's done in explaining the choice that he made here?
I think obviously it's a very high-profile one, and that he has to pick somebody to lead a department that, as Heather mentioned, has a lot of challenges. I do think that it is good that it is his first one, that he's out there talking about it and explaining why he chose Chief Snelling. And I do think it'll be interesting to see what sort of I hate to use the word, but grilling that aldermen give him when he actually goes to be confirmed at the city council. And I think the mayor has some role in talking to aldermen about why this pick is the pick that he wants them to confirm.
Yeah, as folks have mentioned, there's still a huge trust gap between the police department and a lot of communities in Chicago. Melody Mercado, do you think that, having people getting the opportunity to ask questions directly of the top cop nominee, can that help to address some of the trust gap there, or is there still just such a long way to go?
I think there's some things that can do, but at the end of the day, Chief Snelling does decide whether or not to answer a question, whether or not he's playing politics and answering a question with a non-answer, which is something that I see is very common sometimes in these types of forums. And I think, unfortunately, that there are some communities where trust is just irreparably broken, and so they might not even be willing to go to these types of forums and give them a chance.
Becky mentioned, go ahead,
I was going to
please.
say, even though the top person is selected and is there talking, oftentimes communities have to interface with people in their local districts, local commanders, and so that trust has to happen, I think, at a lower level than even the top person coming out to a public meeting once every few years.
Yeah, you're talking to the folks on the beat, not the the superintendent most times.
Right.
You mentioned the alder people. What have we been hearing from folks within city council about is this nomination expected to get cleared?
Hearing from the mayor's allies, they're very confident that they have the votes needed. And hearing from people who are not the mayor's allies, they are pleasantly surprised at how he picked, Chicago native CPD insider, someone who generally seems to have good trust from the rank and file.
Heather, last night commissioners also voted to scrap the much derided gang database, widely reported to be riddled with errors and seen by many folks as a tool for racial profiling. It's been a fight between the Police Oversight Board and the department for a long time. Was there any drama around the vote itself?
None. It was unanimous, and it was clearly something that there was no disagreement on. And it was really a whimper of an ending to a debate that just roiled Chicago politics for many, many years. And it started back in 2017 with the Erase the Database sort of effort, and sort of, reached a peak in April of 2019 when the former Inspector General Joseph Ferguson found that it was riddled with errors and racially targeted Black and Latino Chicagoans. And then Lori Lightfoot was elected and said, no, we still need a gang database. And she spent literally all 4 years of her time in office trying to recreate the database in a way that did not have these same problems and was just unable to do it. During the campaign, Brandon Johnson said he would end the database. The commission did it before he even had to.
So it saved him the effort there. I mean, as Heather mentioned, this has long been such a political hot potato. Allison, do you expect to see the department attempt another version of this, or is this really gone for good at this point?
Based on my year covering overnights and going to crime scenes, beat cops are really, they think they're really familiar with, who is in a gang, who isn't, and just hyper locally, they monitor this in every shooting, at every vigil, because there's retaliation. So there will still be some form of knowledge that they're trying to pass around. I don't know what form it is. I don't know if it'll be better or worse, but definitely something to keep looking out for.
Another big story this week, Becky Vivi, 14 CPS staffers and officials accused by the district's inspector general of fraudulently getting paycheck protection loans. What are the claims here, and how's the district responded?
Yeah, so the inspector general launched an investigation in 2022 that essentially mined the public database of everybody who's gotten a PPP loan. And in speaking with the inspector general, he said that it turned up 780 CPS employees in that database. Now, not all 780, of course, are problematic, or you have a lot of people who might work summers, side businesses. But what they did was they sort of went kind of from the top and looked at people who were in year-round positions, so 52-week positions, and started sort of interrogating and investigating. Were these obtained properly? Were they actually factual, or were they misrepresenting that they had a side business and earned $100,000 in 2019 in order to be eligible for loans, sometimes up to $20K. And so 12 employees, including a very high-level top central office administrator, sometimes reported Crystal Cooper, former chief operating officer, either resigned or were terminated by the board, and then there are 2 of those 14 that are pending termination by the board. And it's possible that there are going to be potentially additional inspector general reports about other further instances of suspected fraud or confirmed fraud.
How badly does something like this erode trust in CPS?
Well, it's so interesting. I've covered CPS many years, and every year the Inspector General puts out an annual report, and it is just quite a read. It is
not in a good way.
Not in a good way, no. But there's a reason we have Inspector Generals, and I will say the Chicago Public Schools is the state's second largest employer. You're dealing with thousands of people. And so, of course, there's going to be some, bad actors in there. And I do think that PPP in particular was riddled with fraud nationally. And it's what prompted the Inspector General's office to launch the broad investigation. And so, unfortunately, that was sort of inviting people to do things that were not above board. And so I would say I don't know that it's the kind of thing that causes people to suddenly distrust the system any more than they may or may not already.
Yeah, they really did try to get those loans out the door so fast, and for good reason.
Correct.
So it kind of stands to reason that there might be some bad actors there. Chalkbeat also reported this week that white students are making up a larger proportion of CPS student population than before. What's the significance there? Why is that?
Sure. So our story looked at actually the percent of students from low-income households
my
dropping.
apologies.
Yes, but there is a slight uptick and a slight change in the racial balance of CPS. So a couple percentage points more white students and Asian or multiracial students. But the drop in students from low-income households is pretty steep. If you look back over a decade, it was 12 percentage points. So we used to be about 88%, and now we're about 73, if I have those numbers correct. You can check out our reporting. But it is a stark drop, and what we did find when we were reporting, our reporter Rima Amin talked a lot to principals on the ground and parents on the ground who, in some communities, that swing went from 80% to 30%. And a lot of that is tethered to housing. And it is perhaps something that anecdotally we all kind of knew, that there are neighborhoods that have gentrified, neighborhoods that are not as affordable for families anymore to live in. And that has really impacted a lot of schools on the ground. And as a district as a whole, we've seen that shrink, and that's going to impact potentially the amount of money we get from the state. And on the school level, it does impact the amount of federal dollars that a school might get to help students who are in higher poverty. But it also creates some diversity economically that presents opportunities as well.
Alice, you had some reporting this week on Mayor Johnson's remarks that he's held to a different standard than other folks are. Tell us what he had to say.
Yeah, this is during the first Tuesday's monthly political discussion event. It was kind of his most, I would say, vulnerable and wide-ranging conversation I've seen from him in public since he became mayor. And it kind of happened after, the bunch of 100-day stories and 1-year anniversary of the Migrant Crisis. So some, tough evaluations there. And, we all know that no one can really accomplish everything they want to do in the first 100 days. But, he did say on the campaign trail specific promises, and there are cabinet positions that are unfilled. So I think there were obviously multiple headlines pointing out that pace, and he kind of expressed frustration with that. And I think where he's coming from is that, when he was elected, everyone made a big deal about how he's the most progressive mayor in generations. I think for progressives, that was very exciting and had a lot of weight to it. I think for others, it might have been concerning, and now they're watching to see what will happen. So I do kind of understand that there is frustration at the anticipation and concern weighing in on him. But reporters and mayors for years and years and decades, we've been just evaluating at that mark.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing that's also happening is that Johnson has really tried to govern in a way that we've never seen before in Chicago. He's been very clear that he wants to be somebody who's a collaborative person, who is deliberative, and who is not sort of a dictator. He's said that several times. And I think that we in Chicago, and as a native Chicagoan, we are all familiar with sort of the daily Rahm school of I am the emperor of Chicago. And Johnson is not only trying to govern as, the most progressive mayor in Chicago history, but he's also trying to govern in a different way. And that, I think, has presented some challenges because we are, I think, culturally as a city somewhat uncomfortable with somebody who says, well, I'm not going to make the final decision. I want to bring everybody together and come to a decision, and then I'm going to implement that decision. The question is, I think he's going to have to grapple with is, when does that deliberative process turn into no decision?
Right.
And does that allow crises, perhaps like the migrant crisis, to fester in a way that ultimately makes it harder for him to achieve what he wants to?
Well,
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the word that we consistently hear Mayor Johnson use is collaboration, and feeling very collaborative. And so I think that a lot of people need to understand collaboration takes time, but also at the same time, as Heather mentioned, sometimes collaborative efforts end up being stonewalled and you end up having to make a decision. And so, yeah, I just think it's very interesting from that point of view.
Well, and speaking of the migrant crisis, you've been reporting on the hostel in Greektown that city leaders are eyeing as a potential home for some of the many asylum seekers that have come to Chicago. What's the status of that project right now?
Yeah, so the move-in date was supposed to be today for migrants. It's been pushed back a week. We don't really know why. We know obviously there's a huge influx of migrants coming in daily, buses and plane. And I think that the city is trying to figure out whether or not to house families there, to house singles. Originally they said it was going to be singles, but now they're seeing a greater need for possibly families. Sure. But I did attend the community meeting on Wednesday. Temperature was pretty lukewarm. I feel like people were really there just to learn more about what the operation plans are going to be, which I feel is a very stark difference to what our reporters have seen across the city in terms of meetings being a little bit more contentious and people having a lot more, feeling more strongly about people coming into the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's certainly been the case in neighborhoods across Chicago. So it seems like here, folks may be a bit more receptive, or at least just trying to gather information right now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that that's fair to say. I would also say that the population in the Greektown, Westtown area is a little bit more affluent. It's also a higher white population. And so the arguments that we're seeing in other communities is in terms of talking about lack of resources for communities of color. Greektown, a little bit different makeup there, and so those conversations aren't really happening as much as we're seeing in other communities.
Mayor Johnson's also pitched the idea of something like a tent city to house some of the asylum seekers. Do you expect that plan to gain some traction?
Well, the first aldermen were briefed today on that plan, so we know a little bit more about it. And essentially, they're looking for 2 acres of land with concrete or asphalt so that they can set up essentially inflatable domes, not really tents, but think of like football practice
Sure.
things that you see. And the idea is that they could house up to 1,000 people instead of sending them to police stations and O'Hare and Midway airports. So I think the question is, can the mayor identify those locations? Those briefings today, as I understand it, did not include specific locations or specific price tags for what those tents would cost to erect and to operate. So those are a lot of unknowns. And it does not appear that there's going to be a specific plan that the City Council will be asked to sign off on in the coming weeks, but I think it is a clear indication that this humanitarian crisis that began in April has accelerated significantly in recent weeks, and that the mayor is struggling to respond to it in a way that keeps people safe. And we were all talking just before we went on the air about that crisp, cold feeling in the air. Winter is coming, and the mayor knows it.
Absolutely. Well, to change gears here somewhat dramatically, but another story that folks have been paying a lot of attention to, the Bally's temporary casino is finally set to open tomorrow morning. What do we know about that?
We know it opens 8 a.m. tomorrow, so set your alarm. I don't know if any of you are big gamblers here, but we know that it will be operating 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 4 a.m. for now, but eventually Bally's is hoping it will be a 24-hour facility. I took a tour of it earlier this week. It's definitely a casino.
Okay, you heard it here first.
Yeah, breaking news. There's slots as far as the eye can see. It's 750 slots, 56 gaming tables, 3 food options for people there. So yeah, if you are ready to go, I guess set your alarm and you could head to Bally's at Medina Temple tomorrow.
Yeah, anybody planning to try your luck?
No, thank you.
Like maybe if they get a residency or something, like get a music, get Adele in here for a few minutes. That could be something.
Is there a performance on the table as well?
Exactly. There was a case this week in court, public housing activists trying to stop the CHA from getting into a long-term lease with the Chicago Fire Football Club. Alice Ian, this was a deal that Mayor Johnson inherited from his predecessor. Does it seem like there's any chance that this court case here can put a stop to the land deal?
I think anything can happen, but certainly when I followed this during the last year of Mayor Lightfoot's term in City Council, it was very contentious. It was, I think, blocked at one point, then reversed, and there were some very real questions that advocates brought up about whether they are allowed to do that given what public housing is meant for.
Yeah, you know, Heather, go ahead.
I was going to say the CHA land swaps have become a thing that I think our officials have not adequately explained.
Sure.
And do certainly raise a lot of suspicions as we're talking about putting a tent up for migrants. You know, you're thinking, well, CHA has a whole lot of land that they should have been building housing on all these years, and instead making swaps and deals. And I know they swapped some land with the schools to build a high school in the south, on the south, near south
There's
side.
been a Target, there's been a police
Yeah.
department.
And not using the land that had been previously used.
Yeah,
So.
even if it is a deal that they can pitch as ultimately beneficial, the optics of it are really difficult with
And they have not done an adequate job of explaining it, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. We also learned this week that federal prosecutors are not planning to call former Alderman Danny Solis in fellow former Alderman Ed Burke's trial. Heather Sharon, do we have any idea why?
So the problem here is that if you put Danny Solis on the stand, he is going to have to answer questions about the crimes that he not only has admitted committing, but that he was accused of committing that prompted him to become, in the terms of the U.S. District Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois, the most significant government informant in modern Chicago political history, which is no small feat. So the prosecutors are hoping that to, avoid that, they can have FBI agents introduce the tapes that he recorded Alderman Burke incriminating himself in, which they will argue to the jury, without having to have Danny Solis answering those questions. It is somewhat disappointing to me personally, and I think that bears mentioning that we will not get to hear Danny Solis explain why Ed Burke asked him if they landed the tuna. And I know I personally had been looking forward to that for many years now, because it has been more than 4 years since Ed Burke was indicted.
It's been a minute, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, Becky, you covered City Hall for a long time. Do you think Ed Burke's legal team is breathing a sigh of relief here?
I mean, I would still be worried about those tapes, man.
Yeah.
I think that the landing of the tuna, it's going to still live on in our hearts for many years. And I would say that they're still going to have quite the trial ahead of them, regardless of Mr. Solis being on the stand.
Yeah. The city budgeting season, as it often is this time of year, is upon us again. Mayor Johnson's got some big ticket items that progressive supporters would like to see. Alice Yin, do we have a sense of where he's going to find the money for all of those?
You know, I think this time around, this budget season isn't going to be like a big grand rollout, these bold, new revenue sources. But, he did mention today that sacrifices will need to be made given the migrant crisis. And projections are looking that by the end of the year, there will be like a deficit in the migrant budget specifically. And if the state doesn't help us, I think there's going to be like some tightening or sacrifices, as the mayor said.
Yeah, and I mean, the mayor has, to the point about being deliberative, collaborative, I mean, he had this public gathering earlier this year to try to solicit ideas about the budget. I mean, Melody Mercado, is that the kind of thing that the average Chicagoan is really engaged in, or does it fly over most folks' heads?
You know, I'm going to say no, but I'm going to say they should be. I think a lot of people pay attention to national politics, and a lot of people neglect the local part of it, and they don't realize that things as small, and it's not small to us, but to other people, budgeting is like, oh, whatever. But this is where decisions are made about how money is allocated, and I think it's important that people go to these meetings if they're able to, watch the live stream, if there is a live stream, and try to figure out, where the money's going, and if you have an idea, share it.
Does Mayor Johnson run the risk, Heather, of alienating some of his progressive supporters if folks don't get the things that they'd like to see in this budget?
So I think we heard him say last night in a speech at the Economic Club of Chicago that he's a big baseball fan and that he loves home runs, but there's nothing wrong with a well-placed bunt to advance the runner around the bases. And I think that is setting up a metaphor for this budget season, because he is going to have to show those progressive supporters progress on reopening the mental health clinics, progress on raising revenue to address homelessness in Chicago. I don't think that his progressive supporters are going to demand walk-off home run, but
Look at
he's,
you knowing baseball
I
stuff.
know, right? I do the sports ball. He's going to have to show progress, but I think they will also settle for a less contentious budget season than each of them were under Lori Lightfoot. And I think Johnson has shown that he's very willing to give even friends and supporters and critics just a little bit of what they need so that the whole process goes smoother.
Yeah.
I was going to say also, it's maybe worth noting that his rise was sort of also playing the long game. So I think it's messaging that he can play the long game now that he's in the seat of governance. I think his supporters will maybe trust him there and say, okay, all right, give us a little this year, give us a little next year.
And that was such a huge question. We got about 30 seconds left, but he came from much more of an organizing background, fairly limited experience in government. Now it seems like it's the time that the rubber meets the road.
Right, and I will say his progressive supporters, they saw their Lightfoot's promises about some of these exact same issues broken, like within a year or two while she took office. So I think they're extra warier, trying to keep his feet to the fire.
Well, we are not wary of any of the four of you. You've been a wonderful panel tonight, but unfortunately we are out of time. So our thanks to Alice Yin, Becky Vivi, Melody Mercado, and Heather Sharon. And that's our show for this Friday night. Don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. Now for the Week in Review, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching, stay healthy and safe, and see you at 10 for Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Okay, the real question that I've been dying to ask everyone is anyone going to the Taste of Chicago this weekend? Yeah?
I have an engagement party tomorrow, for dinner we might, because it's downtown.
That's
Perfect.
nice. I like it. That's a very good way to do it.
Yeah.
Desserts.
It should be in July.
It should be
feel
in
very
July.
strongly about this
I'm
issue.
a little shocked it got
I will say
Yeah.
if it would have happened on the July 4th weekend, it would have been rained out.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm whose attorneys embrace a culture of philanthropy and service by volunteering their time, expertise, and guidance to help others in the greater Chicago community.